So how many people like these the period piece action movies? Movies like Braveheart or Gladiator. Does anyone like those ones? Yeah, some of us do, most maybe not. But these big muscle-clad warriors who lead armies into battle. They bring freedom to the oppressed, and they give these powerful motivational speeches before they lead their people. Notice one's like from Braveheart, where he says, "Tell our enemies they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom." Right? Or the Gladiator who says, "Brothers, what we do in life echoes in eternity." Or then there's Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings as the characters gather and they're about to attack Mordor and try to defeat the enemy. He says, "A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields, when the age of men come crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight." And all the people cheer, and they go rush into battle. And they go and they overtake their enemy, and there's much rejoicing. And that's maybe what you think of when we think about judges, right? We think about these big, muscular warriors who's going to free God's people from oppression. And that's kind of what we saw last week. We saw with the story of Eglon. He was the quintessential judge, a man of might and valor, a man of honor, one who was a devoted follower of God, who led his people into victory from defeating the Canaanites and brought peace to the land for 40 years. And the story of Othniel, we kind of see this cycle that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks, this cycle that's going to be repeated over and over throughout the book of Judges. And if you remember last week, there's a kind of 7 points to this cycle. It kind of keeps going around and around. The first point is abandon, where the people fail to drive out the others, and they turn their back on God. They begin to practice idolatry and to worship other gods. And as God sees that, he sees this idolatry happening. It fills him with anger, a righteous anger, because what he's seeing to him is comparable to adultery or prostitution. It fills him with anger, even though he's slow to anger. What God does is he allows the people to face consequences. He allows them to experience the consequences of their choices. If they want to follow other gods, he's going to give them over to these nations that follow other gods. And eventually, these nations oppress the people of Israel. And finally, they see the error of their ways, and they cry out to God. They cry out to God to rescue them. And we know that God hears their cries, and he's a God that's gracious and compassionate. And so it says that he raises up a deliverer. He sends someone to rescue them, to drive out the oppressors and bring freedom to the people. And that leads to a time of peace. But then, after a time of peace, the people forget God. And it says after the death of the judge, the cycle seems to start over again. And we'll see that the cycle seems to happen a little bit more each time. It gets a little bit louder and a little bit worse. And it repeats itself over and over. And we'll see that today with the story of Ehud. And the story of Ehud takes place in Judges chapter 3, starting with verse 11, if you want to follow along. But verse 11 tells us that the cycle begins with the death of Othniel. He dies after 40 years of peace. It says, then goes to the next phase, that the people of Israel abandon God, and they again do what is evil in the Lord's sight. Of course, this what moves to anger, and God then gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. because of what they had done, because they had done evil in his sight. And because of that, because God gave Eglon power, that Eglon attacks and defeats Israel. There's consequences for their actions. And he takes over the city of Palms, which was Jericho, the one that the Israelites had marched around to free. And the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. So 18 years they lived under the oppression of Moab and King Eglon. And after 18 years, they begin to realize that maybe this isn't the way it should be. And they cry out to God. It says that the Israelites cried out to the Lord. As he heard them, he raised up for them Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed Benjamite, to deliver them. And we kind of fast forward to the end of the story, and it says that the Israelites struck down 10,000 Moabites, all stout and able-bodied men. None of them were able to escape. We'll kind of fill in the gaps in just a minute what happens. But finally, it leads to a time of peace, that Moab becomes subjects of Israel, and there's peace in Israel for 80 years. And then we turn the page. It says in chapter 4, verse 1, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And so the cycle repeats itself kind of over and over. And we see that this cycle, though, it changes. Every time the cycle appears, something different is going on. And we see God had raised up a dedicated, honorable military leader, one who loved God, but now make way for Ehud. He's not what you would expect. God brings in Ehud, who's not a military leader, but a covert assassin. And so we're now going to look at kind of what happens, what unfolds in verses 15 to 26. If you want to follow along, and kind of paraphrase some of it and just kind of dive into it. It's kind of an interesting story. You might wonder why a story like this would be in the Bible. And so he raised up Ehud, the son of Gera, a left-handed Benjamite, as deliverer. So Ehud comes on the scene, and the Israelites sent him to Eglon. He sends him to Eglon, as what happened was Eglon was collecting tributes from the people. He was their ruler, and he would have them bring the spoils to him. He was collecting these things from the people, and the people would bring a group of them would bring these tributes to Eglon, who would kind of take them and use them for his own bidding. And so Ehud uses that opportunity as he's being sent to be one of the deliverers of this tribute. He's using it as a chance to stage an assassination. It says that Ehud, he made a double-edged sword, about 18 inches in length, so about 1.5 feet long, and he straps it to the right thigh under his clothes. And he brought the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. So, and that's partly because he straps it to, you might wonder, okay, what's the big deal? Why is he strapping to the right side? Because most people are right-handed, so when you pull your weapon, it's going to be on your left side. So he has it strapped to his right side because he's left-handed. And so he comes and he brings the tributes, but then him and his group of people leave. They leave the king. But then, and Ehud sends the people on their way. He sends the rest of the people on his way. And he says he's going to return to the king Eglon. So he returns to Eglon, and he says to him, I have a secret message for you. And the king listens to him, and he releases all the people, and so he's left alone with Ehud. And Ehud's like, I have a secret message from you, a message from God. And so it says that Ehud comes to him, and the king stood up. And this is kind of interesting. It says, so one thing we need to understand, though, about Ehud, or Eglon, the names get confusing. Eglon's the king of Moab. And one thing we have to know about him is he is extremely fat. After years of collecting tributes, he's put on a lot of weight, used it, and so that's one of the things we'll learn about him. So Ehud comes in and he says, I've got the secret message. It's a message from God. And so he wants to know, and it says, Ehud reached with his left hand and he pulled out the sword with his, that was on his right thigh, and he plunged it into Eglon's belly. And then even the handle went in after the blade. So plunged it all the way in, over 18 inches deep. And then the fat closed around it. So Ehud could not withdraw the sword. So the man's fat covered his hand, so he couldn't even pull the sword out. That's just kind of gross. And then the final part, and waist came out. I'm sure you can know what that means. Yes, there are kids here. They should know this is in the Bible. So you never thought you'd hear a sermon about an assassination, extremely fat people, and people having their waist come out. Right? But it happens. All right. And then, so Ehud's now in this room with this dead king, and he has to find a way out. So he goes and he locks the doors from the inside. And it says he kind of sneaks out the back and he gets away. And you wonder, when did the people know what's going on? When did they figure it out pretty quickly? This is where it gets even more interesting. It says, when Eglon's servants came in, and they looked and they found the doors of the upstairs room locked, they thought he was relieving himself in the cool room. All right. And the servants waited until they became embarrassed and saw that he had not opened the doors to the upstairs room. So they took the key and opened the doors, and there was their Lord lying dead on the floor. So they waited because they thought he was in the restroom. They thought they would give him time. They didn't want to disturb him, only to come and find out that he's dead. And this gives Ehud a chance to get away, and it gives him a chance to rally the people of Israel, and they go and they attack the Moabites and they defeat them. And now the oppressors become the oppressed, and the people of Israel have peace for 80 years. Kind of one of my favorite stories. So kind of an interesting thing. But within the story, we have these two men, Eglon, king of Moab, and Ehud, the left-handed Benjamin. We're going to kind of look at these two men and kind of see maybe we can pull out of the story. First, we've got Eglon, the king of Moab. All right. Now, Moab is the people of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew and Lot's daughter. It's a kind of a disturbing story as well, found in Genesis 19. But the Eglon is that king of that people, and God gives him power over Israel. And they go and they attack the Israelites with a group of others, and they take over the city of palms. As I said before, that's also known as Jericho. If you remember the story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho, they walked around and they blew the trumpets and the walls come tumbling down. So God handed over Jericho to the people of Israel many years before. But now, because of their idolatry, because of their turning their back on God, God now hands that city over to a foreign nation. And says that they were oppressed then. They served King Eglon for 18 years. The Israelites served him, and they were oppressed. When we saw the story of Othniel, they were under oppression for about 8 years. So now it's 18 years. You see, it kind of takes them longer to see the error of their ways. And part of that is because it says they were bringing tribute to King Eglon. The consequence of their sin and idolatry isn't just bondage, but it's forced to bring gifts to their oppressors. Right? They're forced to bring these tributes, these taxation, these things that they could have used for themselves to bring to the king of Moab. But as I said, one of the defining things about Eglon is his weight. As the Bible tells us, he is an extremely fat man. And so maybe 18 years of receiving tributes He's gotten fattened on his greed and his tyranny. I saw this in my Bible, and I thought this was interesting. It says that Eglon's name means calf. A feature that resonates with the emphasis throughout the narrative of his fatness. Together with Eglon's name, it has marked him as a fattened calf, ripe for the slaughter. And so this obesity of this man is kind of played off in this comical sense, that he's so fat that when he gets stabbed in the stomach, the blade gets stuck and his fat covers it. But we can take a look at this story almost in an allegorical sense about the oppressive weight of our sin. The weight of our sin is killing us and it's pulling us down. But even more than that, that the people were bringing tribute to this man. And often we pay tribute to our sins. We give our sins, our idols, our things, the things that it wants. Like an addict, offering its time, its money, its resources, relationships to the altar of their addiction. We often bring tribute to the things that hold us captive. We sacrifice much. We sacrifice so much to please these gods that keep us captive. We offer them our money, our time, our friendships, our worship, all these things to appease the false gods in our lives. We allow the sin to oppress us. We bring these tributes to them. And we, just like the people of Israel, they could have cried out sooner. Could have cried out for freedom sooner, but they find that appeasing the oppressor is easier than confessing the evil and crying out for deliverance. Another quote says that from Tim Keller says that when we worship an idol, we are trying to stay fully in control of our lives, negotiating with this idol god, giving it what it wants. We give our idols these tributes, and so that it gives us what we want. So we think if we give them what it wants, we'll get what we want. And he says it's not loving submission, but cynical manipulation. So we manipulate things to get what we want. We give tributes to our false gods to think that it will give us the things that we need. But I want you to ask yourself, what is the weight of your sin? What is it that's weighing you down, pulling you down, keeping you from truly following God? Maybe what are the gifts that you're bringing? What are the tributes that you're bringing to these gods in your life instead of crying out to God for deliverance? As I said, there are two men. We've got Eglon, and then we've got Ehud, the judge, right? And he isn't this valiant, honorable warrior. He's an assassin sent to deliver tribute, but he brings something else. He brings a message from God, a deadly blow that he brings freedom from oppression for his people. And his message is that the weight of oppression and slavery is over, and freedom is now at hand. And he's not what we would expect as a judge. As it says, he's a left-handed Benjamite. And that might not mean much to us right now. It's like, okay, cool, he's left-handed. How many people here are left-handed? We got a couple of lefties. That's good, so watch out for them. Check for swords on the right side. But he comes from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Benjaminite. And the word, if you don't know Benjamin, means the son of my right hand. So it's interesting that they're making this distinction that he's left-handed, but he comes from a tribe known as the son of my right hand. And the truth is that this idea of right hand is known as positive imagery throughout the scripture and probably in a lot in the world today. You know, right hand is often the symbol of power and authority. In the Bible, we see that God swears by his right hand. We hear that Jesus sits at the right hand of God. The story of when Jesus talks about how God's going to separate the sheep from the goats. The sheep who are God's people go to the right, and the goats who are those who turn their back on God are to the left. But the story, it emphasizes the one thing we know about Ehud is that he is left-handed. Because God is, once again, he flips the script and he turns our expectations on their heads. He takes this symbol of authority and says, I'm going to do it my way. Now, when I read this story, I think of someone like, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or Russell Crowe training to be this assassin, right? And he's learning to use his left hand and wield the assassin's blade. Or maybe if you're like me, you're thinking of The Princess Bride. How many people have seen The Princess Bride? Where the guy is like having a sword fight. And he's like, well, actually, I'm not left-handed. And he switches his sword to the right hand and he takes him down. And so we think this is the image of what we would think Ehud is like. He's just left-handed. But the interesting thing is, as you read it, as you look into what it is, it's not saying that he's left-handed. And a simple reading might make us think that. But originally, it really says that he was unable to use his right hand. In other words, he was disabled or handicapped. He was so he had no use. His either right hand was paralyzed or injured or somehow unable to use that. And you would think then that this person would probably was looked down upon in that society. They would see him as handicapped, a person with a disability. In fact, that would be why they would have no reason to suspect him to be an assassin. I mean, they would see that his disability and they would think there was nothing wrong, he could do nothing. In fact, Michael Wilcox in his book, The Message of Judges, says, everyone looks at Ehud's withered right hand, and no one is expecting the dexterity in the left. Everyone assumes that he cannot wield a weapon in his right hand, and he cannot wield it at all. And that is why it is acceptable, he is acceptable as an envoy to the court of Moab, and why he's admitted into the presence of the king for a private audience. His deformity presents no security risk to the Moabites. And so they think, oh, he's a non-threat. He has no use of his right arm. He has no threat to us. So sure, he can be alone with the king. In fact, Wilcox goes on to say that possibly the people of Israel also saw him as a non-threat. As he writes, perhaps that is also why the Israelites have chosen him in the first place. Israel sees Ehud the same way as the Moab see him, a man whose value to both sides lies precisely in what he cannot do. We don't want any trouble, they think. If some hotheads are talking about a champion who will deliver Israel by the strength of his good right hand, then Ehud is the man least likely to do just that. And so for Ehud, it's his being left-handed isn't just a choice, it's who he had to be. And probably he viewed it himself as his weakness his whole life. I mean, it's probably the one thing in his life he wished he could change. The one thing that kind of always made him feel bad about himself, affected his self-confidence. And he probably, as he would walk down the street, people would see him and think of him as a charity case because of his withered right hand. And the truth is, if we think about it, that we all have these type of weaknesses. These things about ourselves that we wish we could change, these things that we don't like, that we think don't bring us value in our lives. And some of us are ashamed by these weaknesses. We try to hide it. We don't want people to know that we're weak in that area. Some of us try to overcompensate by exaggerating other things in our lives. So we hide our weaknesses by exaggerating other things about ourselves. And some, they have their weakness and they know it and they flaunt it. They use it to get what they want. Because we all have these weaknesses. For Ehud, it was a physical ailment. Maybe some of you have that. Some of us is an addiction or codependent relationships or a bad temper or struggle financially. We all have these weaknesses, things that in our lives that we wish we could change, things that we think that if they were only different, our lives would be better. I can imagine as I sit here talking about this, you're thinking about your weakness, your flaw, the thing that you wish in your life that was different, the thing that you wish that God would change or remove, this thorn in your flesh, this thing that's a constant irritant for you. And when the Lord raised up Ehud, he probably didn't think he was worth it. He probably thought, God, how could you use someone like me? I have no use of my right arm. Just like Moses, who said he couldn't speak. Or Noah, who had a problem with alcohol. Or Solomon, who was a womanizer and seemed to have every woman he saw. Or Peter, who would continually put his foot in his mouth. Ehud, who was left-handed because he had no use of his right hand, must have thought himself as weak or insignificant. And so our series is called The Cycle, Finding Ourselves in the Pattern of the Judges. And we think about this story, we look at the story of Ehud, we can discover that God brings rescue to his people, not through strength, but through weakness. God used Ehud's weakness, his disability, and turned it into his greatest ability. Another person who had a weakness was the Apostle Paul, and he struggled with this. In fact, we're going to look at a passage from 2 Corinthians, and it says, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me. Paul knew he had a weakness. He had something that was an irritant to him. Some suggested maybe it was blindness. Others suggest maybe there was just this person that was kind of always out to get him or bugging him. We don't really know what his weakness was. But actually, Paul admits that what his true weakness is his pride, his arrogance. He says, so that I would not exalt myself, so that I would not make myself be so confident and so arrogant, God gave me this thorn in my flesh to keep me. And so God gives him that to keep him from bringing tribute to his pride and to his arrogance. And so and then Paul says that I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. He asked God to remove his weakness, to get rid of this thorn in his side. And I can only imagine Ehud did the same. He would cry out to God for God to heal him, wondering why God would not let him do that, why God would not bring healing to his arm. But eventually Paul comes to his conclusion. He says, but God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is perfected in weakness. This weakness that he had actually builds up a dependency on God. And he sees this weakness, it keeps him from bringing tribute to the idols of his life. And it helps him rely on God's amazing grace. God uses our weakness to display his power, so that as Paul writes here, that I will gladly boast all the more of my weakness. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul can boast about his weakness because in the kingdom of God, weakness turns into strength. Our weakness helps us rely and become dependent on the strength of God. And we all have our weaknesses. We all have our struggles, these things that we wish were different. I'll share another example of a good friend of mine, my friend Judy Moody. Judy has been an active participant, actively involved in Alcoholics Anonymous for 40 years. Now, she She told me when she first kind of went to an AA meeting, it was across the street from her church, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to go. She didn't want people to see her going to one of these meetings. And she could have kept this weakness hidden. But instead of hiding it, she embraced it. And over this 40 years, she's learned to share her journey with so many people. She openly shares the struggles that she faces. And in her weakness, she's learned to reach out to others, to encourage others to join in the program. She's sponsored others to help them stay committed and stay focused in their goal of sobriety. And she continues even to this day, after 40 years, to attend meetings, to share her struggles and her victories, to let people know that they too can find peace. She even said the other day that the people at this meeting, they refer to her as like the old lady, right? Which is really a term of honor and respect. They see her as someone who's been committed to the program, and they can see that this program works. So God has used her in this weakness. And she could have cried out to God at the beginning. I'm sure she did, just for God just to take it away and to give her the strength, and that she could just move on. But instead, God used her in ways through this weakness, in ways that she would never know, to help people, to touch people's lives, to help lift people from the oppressive weight of alcohol addiction, and to deliver them from bondage into peace. And so she, like Paul can say, I will most gladly boast of all the more about my weakness, for when I am weak, then I am strong. So, like Ehud, we all have our weaknesses, our struggles, our things that we think are going to keep us down. We think that God will use the powerful and the noble to get his job done. But as we go through the scriptures, we see that it's filled with God using the weak and the foolish to shame the wise and the strong. And so hear me today that God has chosen you, each and every one of you. God has chosen you in spite of your weakness. He's chosen you because of your weakness. He's chosen to use you through your weakness so that people will boast about God's amazing grace. As Timothy Keller says, that God is a God of grace, not works. He takes and he uses people who are in the margins of society in order to show that salvation is from him and not for our own human ability. God tends to choose and use people who are weaker socially, morally, physically, and even morally. Why? So that no human being might boast in the presence of God. God can use you. God wants to use you, and God will use you. Not some muscle-clad warrior, not Braveheart or the Gladiator, not a Hollywood superstar. God chooses people like you and me, weak and insignificant, to bring something out of nothing, to help bring freedom, not just to our lives, but to the lives of others. So ask yourself, where do you feel weak? And invite God into that weakness. And ask God to use that weakness, to use that broken, insignificant part of you, to use it to boast about his glory, to help bring freedom to those who are held captive to the weight of oppression, to release people from paying tribute to their bloated sinfulness. Invite God to use your weakness so that we can, like Paul, say that we will most gladly boast all the more of our weakness, for when we are weak, then we are strong.